Donald Trump sat down for an interview with the Washington Post, and he made one of his most ridiculous claims yet. So let me tell you what he said, and then I'll explain why it's so absurd. They report here, the Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump said in a wide-ranging interview with the Washington Post that he'd be able to get rid of the more than $19 trillion in debt over a period of 8 years. That's a quote, over a period of 8 years. That could require using $2 trillion a year from the annual $4 trillion budget to pay off holders of the debt. All right, so I need everybody to understand that that is not only improbable, it's more like impossible. You just can't do it. So when people talk about balancing the budget, which is something sometimes you'll hear from right-wing politicians, even from some liberals, when they say, oh, okay, we're trying to balance the budget. They're not talking about eliminating the national debt. They're talking about eliminating the annual deficit, which is the yearly deficit that we have. The national debt has been accumulated since the founding of the fucking country. To get rid of that is not a thing. Like, that's not like an option. Like, oh, let's 19 trillion. Okay, let's try to do that. So many people don't know this, but you actually need a national debt because as a general rule, public debt, which is what the annual deficit and the national debt are, that equals private surplus. So I have this phrase that I like to use when I talk about it, which is that public debt is actually the lifeblood of capitalism. So when you have the government spending and you have public debt, that's going somewhere. Oftentimes, it goes into the private sector. When it goes into the private sector, you have more job creation and you have an economy that's doing better. This is, Keynesianism 101, especially when there's a downturn in, whenever there's a recession or a depression. The idea is the government is the spender of last resort, and then they pump capital into the economy, and then, there's hopefully a recovery. And this is what we've seen from the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession when we did the stimulus package. This is something that we've seen that's actually helped. And furthermore, that $19 trillion number is totally misleading because you have to look at what's a more accurate measure of the place we're at is looking at the national debt as a percentage of GDP. So today in the U.S., it's about 100%. And to put that into perspective for you, because some people say, oh my God, the debt's the worst it's ever been. It's so bad. We're all going to die. After World War II, it was 113% of GDP. So the debt now is less than it was in 1945. And to put that in perspective, the debt today in Japan, for example, modern nation, over 200%. And you have people who are, right-wing economically who've looked at Japan and they've been like, any day now there's going to be a debt crisis, any day now. But they've been saying that for over a fucking decade. So it's just, he has no clue how the economy works. Look, if he were to come out and say, I'm going to eliminate the annual deficit, I think that's a pretty reasonable position. In fact, Obama's kind of moved in that direction. He inherited a $1.4 trillion annual deficit, and he cut that to about $480 billion. So, that's one of the goals of many things that he worked on, and he got close to it. So that's a reasonable thing. If he came out and said, I want to balance the annual budget and eliminate the deficit, that's fine. But when he says something like, I want to get rid of the national debt, that's not a thing. Like, that's not... Nobody does that. Nobody says that because you can't do it because it doesn't make sense to do it. And furthermore, if you tried to do it, let's say he took $2 trillion out of the federal budget every year and put it towards that. There would be a recession or even worse, a depression of the likes we've never seen. It would be worse than the Great Depression. Because fully cutting half of government spending and just putting it to pay down the national debt, you would have to get rid of the entire military. Which is something I'm not even in favor of, as much as I want to cut military spending, and I'd cut it by like 50%. But you'd have to either get rid of the entire military or get rid of all of the, social spending and anti-poverty programs. So you can't do it. You just can't do it. It's not a thing. It's not a position. It's not something an adult would say. There are economists all across the world that fucking facepalm when they hear somebody say something so profoundly ignorant. We're going to get rid of the $19 trillion in debt. If anything, and you mean the annual deficit, fine. And I might even agree with you on that. But if you say the national debt, you're just an ignorant prick.